What if the most dangerous person you would ever meet didn't carry a weapon, didn't threaten you, and didn't look dangerous at all? What if the moment you let your guard down, just for one night, was the moment your fate was sealed? And how did a string of deaths, dismissed at first as tragic but ordinary overdoses, reveal one of the most unsettling criminal patterns Ohio had seen in years? In cities across America, overdoses have become heartbreakingly common. Police respond, medics arrive, a report is filed, another life is added to the numbers. But sometimes, buried inside those numbers, is a story that refuses to stay hidden. This is one of those stories. Columbus, Ohio, a growing Midwestern city known for its universities, thriving nightlife, and neighborhoods where people believe they know their surroundings. It's a city of movement, of short-term stays and long nights, where strangers cross paths and disappear again without a trace. In late 2022, emergency calls began coming in. Men found unresponsive. Hotel rooms, apartments, no obvious signs of violence. At first glance, the cause seemed clear: drugs. Police officers and paramedics were already overwhelmed by the opioid crisis. Fentanyl had changed the landscape, turning even small doses into deadly risks. These deaths, tragic as they were, didn't immediately raise alarms, until they started to repeat. Different locations, different victims, but familiar circumstances. Each man had recently met someone. Each man had been alive and communicating shortly before, and each man died alone. Over time, investigators would realize something chilling. These men weren't just victims of addiction or bad luck. They were connected, for men would eventually be confirmed dead. One would survive, and all of them had crossed paths with the same woman. Her name was Rebecca Alborn. Rebecca Alborn was 36 years old, a resident of Columbus, not someone who stood out in a crowd, not someone neighbors whispered about. She did not stalk dark streets or force her way into homes. According to authorities, she met her victims openly, through arrangements that began with conversation, agreement, and trust. That trust, prosecutors would later argue, was the most dangerous part. But in the beginning, no one was looking at her. The early deaths were treated like so many others, isolated, unfortunate, and painfully familiar. The victims were adult men. There were no witnesses demanding answers, no immediate signs of foul play. Families mourned quietly, friends searched for explanations, and the city moved on. When crimes don't look like crimes, they are the hardest to see. Behind closed doors and dimly lit rooms, something was happening, something investigators wouldn't fully understand until much later. Each victim had a story, a life, people who expected them home. They weren't statistics, and they weren't connected to each other. Except for one detail no one noticed at first. They had all spent time with the same woman shortly before they died. As weeks turned into months, detectives would begin to ask questions that challenged their earliest assumptions. Why did the circumstances look so similar? Why did personal items go missing? Why did one man survive when the others didn't? And most importantly, why did the same name keep appearing? The answers would not come quickly. They never do in cases like this. But when the pieces finally began to align, authorities would use a term rarely spoken in modern Ohio criminal cases, especially involving drugs. They would call it serial killings, not carried out with knives or guns, but through access, opportunity, and control. This is not just a story about crime. It's a story about how patterns hide in plain sight, about how vulnerability can be exploited, and how danger doesn't always announce itself. In the parts ahead, we will follow the timeline of the deaths, the investigation that slowly uncovered the truth, and the courtroom that ultimately brought this case into the light. But first, you have to understand how easily it all began, and how long it took before anyone realized something was terribly wrong.
What if the first death had been questioned more closely? What if the pattern had been recognized sooner? And how many signs have to repeat before coincidence becomes something far more disturbing? The timeline begins quietly, the way many of the most unsettling cases do. In late 2022, Columbus emergency responders were called to a scene that looked tragically familiar. An adult man had been found unresponsive after spending time with a woman he had recently met. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no obvious indication of violence, just drugs in his system, powerful opioids, including fentanyl. In a city already struggling with overdose deaths, the incident did not immediately stand out. The death was logged, processed and folded into a growing list of similar tragedies happening across the region. No one, at that moment, believed they were witnessing the beginning of something larger. Then, weeks later, it happened again. Another man was found dead under nearly identical circumstances. He, too, had recently met a woman. He, too, had consumed drugs shortly before his death. And once again, there were no signs of physical violence. Different location, same outcome. At the time, investigators still saw no clear reason to connect the two cases. Overdoses, especially those involving fentanyl, often appear sudden and unpredictable. Without witnesses or clear forensic red flags, there was little to suggest homicide. But the similarities were already there, quietly waiting to be noticed. As 2023 began, the incidents did not stop. In January, another man was found unresponsive. The details echoed the earlier deaths. A recent meeting, drugs present, death occurring in a private setting. Again, there was no immediate sign of foul play. Then came another. By the time spring approached, investigators were now looking at multiple deaths spread across different months, all involving adult men, all involving drugs, and all involving short-term encounters. Still, each case was handled individually. The common thread had not yet been pulled. Between January and June of 2023, the number would rise to 4 confirmed fatalities. For men, for separate scenes, for deaths that looked, on paper, like overdoses. But when detectives later reviewed the timeline side by side, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Each victim had met the same woman shortly before losing consciousness. Each encounter followed a similar sequence of events. Each death occurred when the victim was alone, and each time, the woman left alive. Her name appeared again and again in phone records, messages, and location data. Rebecca Auburn. At first, her presence raised questions, but not conclusions. Was she simply unlucky? Was she a witness? Or was she something else entirely? Before investigators could answer that, another critical moment occurred, one that would shift the trajectory of the case. A man survived. In this 5th incident, the outcome was different. Like the others, the man had met Rebecca Auburn. Like the others, drugs were involved. But unlike the previous victims, he regained consciousness. What he told investigators would later prove pivotal. He described becoming incapacitated far more quickly than expected. When he woke up, personal belongings were missing. He had survived an overdose that easily could have killed him. This was no longer just a string of deaths. It was a pattern with a witness. As investigators began mapping the timeline more carefully, new details emerged. The locations were scattered but strategic. Hotels, short-term residences, apartments near major roadways, places where people come and go, and where privacy is temporary. Each scene alone did not raise alarms. But together, they told a story. The timing, the repetition, the consistency. These deaths were no longer isolated events. They were chapters in the same narrative. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly to those willing to look. By mid-2023, authorities began asking a question that fundamentally changed the investigation. Were these accidental overdoses? Or were the drugs being used deliberately? The answer would not come immediately. But once the timeline was fully laid out, month by month, victim by victim, coincidence became harder to defend. For men were dead, one had survived, and the same woman stood at the center of every encounter. What began as a series of tragic, forgettable incidents was now something else entirely, something that demanded answers. In the next part of this story, investigators will begin connecting the dots, examining evidence, digital trails, and testimonies that would transform suspicion into certainty. But it all began here, with a timeline no one saw coming, and deaths no one thought to connect, until it was too late.
How many coincidences does it take before investigators stop calling them coincidences? And at what point does a familiar tragedy transform into something far more deliberate? At first, there was no reason to believe these deaths were connected. In Columbus, overdose investigations were tragically routine. Officers responded, paramedics documented, and medical examiners determined cause of death. In most cases, there were no witnesses, no forced entry, no visible injuries, nothing that immediately pointed to homicide. Each death was investigated on its own, isolated in time, place, and paperwork. But as the months passed, something began to trouble a small group of detectives. The similarities were subtle at first, not the kind that jump off a page, the kind that linger. Multiple victims had met someone shortly before dying. Multiple scenes involved short-term stays. Multiple cases included missing cash or personal items. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they suggested a pattern. Detectives began reviewing phone records. When they overlaid contact logs from different victims, one name kept appearing, sometimes hours before death, sometimes the night of. Rebecca Auburn. At first, investigators treated her as a potential witness. But then came surveillance footage. Hotel cameras placed Auburn entering rooms with different men and later leaving alone. The timestamps aligned closely with when the victims were last known to be alive. Still, this was not proof of murder. Presence does not equal guilt, but it raised questions. Investigators then turned to financial records. Bank statements and transaction histories showed withdrawals and charges made shortly after some of the deaths. In several cases, money or valuables were unaccounted for. The working theory began to shift. What if the drugs weren't just part of the environment? What if they were part of the method? The Columbus Police Department expanded the scope of the investigation. They reached out to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, bringing in analysts experienced in complex, multi-case reviews. Detectives laid everything out chronologically, victim by victim, date by date, location by location. When viewed side by side, the repetition was unmistakable. Patterns don't shout. They whisper until someone finally listens. The investigation reached a turning point with the surviving victim. Unlike the others, this man could speak. He told detectives he had met Rebecca Auburn for sex. He described consuming drugs she had provided, and then losing consciousness far faster than expected. When he woke up, his belongings were gone, and he had nearly died. This account changed everything. For the first time, investigators had confirmation that the drugs may not have been incidental. They may have been administered with intent. Toxicology reports added weight to that suspicion. Medical examiners found lethal or near-lethal levels of opioids, including fentanyl, in the victim's systems. Levels that raised serious doubts about accidental use. The consistency was key. Different men, different dates, same outcome. Investigators began consulting medical experts and forensic toxicologists. They asked difficult questions. Were these dosages consistent with voluntary use? How quickly would loss of consciousness occur? Could these levels be explained by recreational activity alone? The answers pointed in one direction. These were not random overdoses. As evidence mounted, detectives reclassified the investigation. What had once been separate overdose cases was now treated as a connected series. Authorities began using language rarely spoken in modern criminal cases involving drugs. They began using the word serial, not because of the weapon used, but because of the repeated, intentional pattern. A serial offender doesn't need a knife or a gun. All they need is access and time. By mid-2023, investigators believed Rebecca Auburn was not simply present at these deaths. They believed she orchestrated them, operating quietly, blending in, leaving behind scenes that looked tragically ordinary. The investigation was no longer about whether the deaths were connected. It was about how to prove it and how to stop it. In the next part of this story, the focus will turn fully to the suspect, her background, her movements, and the motive prosecutors believe drove her actions. But the truth had already begun to surface, hidden in data, buried in patterns, waiting for someone to put the pieces together.
What does a serial killer look like when they don't look like one at all? And how do you recognize danger when it arrives disguised as familiarity? Rebecca Auburn did not fit the image most people expect. She did not live in isolation. She did not appear threatening. She did not leave behind scenes marked by violence or chaos. According to investigators, that was precisely why she went unnoticed for so long. Rebecca Auburn was a Columbus resident living an outwardly unremarkable life. There were no early warnings that placed her on law enforcement's radar. No known history that suggested she would become the center of a multi-victim homicide investigation. And yet, as detectives began reconstructing her movements, a disturbing portrait started to emerge. This was not a predator who forced her way into people's lives. This was someone who was invited in. According to court records and prosecutors, Auburn met men through personal arrangements that relied on consent and mutual agreement. These encounters began like countless others. Brief conversations, planned meetings, trust established quickly. That trust, authorities argued, was the critical vulnerability. Prosecutors stated that once Auburn gained access to her victims, drugs became central to the encounters. Investigators believe she introduced substances that rapidly impaired the men's ability to protect themselves or remain aware of what was happening around them. What followed, authorities said, was exploitation. Victims were left incapacitated. Property was taken. Money, credit cards, and personal items disappeared. In 4 cases, the men never recovered. Unlike many serial killers driven by ideology, rage, or compulsion, this case appeared rooted in something far more calculated: money. Investigators and prosecutors described a motive centered on financial gain, a pattern of theft following each encounter that mirrored the timing of the overdoses. This was not random behavior. It was consistent. Each encounter followed a similar sequence. Each outcome benefited the same person. Each risk was taken again and again and again. Investigators emphasized that this repetition mattered. Crimes of opportunity happen once. Patterns happen by choice. Intent is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, revealed only through repetition. As detectives dug deeper, they examined Auburn's behavior before and after each incident. They looked at travel patterns, communication logs, and financial activity. What they found supported the prosecution's theory. These were not impulsive acts. They were deliberate. Authorities noted that Auburn did not panic after the deaths. She did not immediately flee. She continued meeting men, continued operating within the same routines. To investigators, this suggested confidence and familiarity. This was someone who believed her actions would not be questioned, because they hadn't been. The role of addiction and vulnerability also became central to understanding motive. Prosecutors argued that Auburn exploited environments where drug use was already present, spaces where overdoses were tragically common and rarely scrutinized as potential crimes. In that environment, death could hide in plain sight. When a crime looks like an accident, it is less likely to be challenged. And when it repeats without consequence, it becomes easier to repeat again. Investigators were careful not to sensationalize the case. They focused on behavior, evidence, and intent. And as the case moved forward, Ohio officials made their position clear. These were not tragic coincidences. These were not unpredictable outcomes. These were not accidents. In official statements, authorities described the acts plainly: a pattern of killings carried out through deception and exploitation. Not through force, not through fear, but through access. For the families of the victims, this understanding was devastating. Their loved ones had trusted someone. They had entered encounters believing they would leave alive. They never did. And for investigators, the case challenged long-held assumptions about what serial crime looks like and who commits it. Sometimes the most dangerous threat isn't the one you run from. It's the one you let close. In the next part of this story, the focus will shift to the moment when suspicion turned into action, when investigators moved from theory to arrest, and the case finally entered a courtroom. But before that happened, one truth had already become clear. Rebecca Auburn was no longer a background figure. She was the center of the case.
When does suspicion become certainty? And what does justice look like when the crimes never looked like crimes at all? By mid-2023, investigators believed they had reached that moment. After months of piecing together timelines, digital records, toxicology results, and witness accounts, law enforcement made their move. Rebecca Auburn was arrested. The arrest did not come with spectacle. There was no dramatic chase, no public confrontation. Instead, it arrived the way the investigation had unfolded, quietly, methodically, and backed by evidence. Prosecutors moved quickly. In court filings, the scope of the case became clear. A grand jury indictment charged Rebecca Auburn with 4 counts of murder, along with a series of related felony charges tied to robbery, drug offenses, and exploitation. For the first time, what had long appeared as isolated overdoses were formally recognized as homicides. The language of the courtroom transformed the narrative. These were no longer accidents. They were crimes. The case immediately drew attention beyond Ohio. Female serial killers are rare. Serial killings involving drugs rather than physical violence are rarer still. Legal analysts noted that the prosecution's theory challenged traditional assumptions. showing how lethal intent can hide behind behaviors society often overlooks. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their case. They presented digital communication records linking Auburn to each victim, financial evidence showing theft following the encounters, surveillance footage placing her at key locations. Most importantly, they presented consistency, the same pattern, the same outcome, the same suspect. Defense attorneys reviewed the evidence, and the reality became difficult to contest. Faced with the weight of the case, Rebecca Auburn ultimately made a decision. She pleaded guilty. With that plea, the trial phase came to an end, but the emotional weight of the case did not. A guilty plea is not just a legal act. It is an acknowledgement, and for many families, a moment they never imagined would come. During court proceedings, family members of the victims were given the opportunity to speak. They talked about ordinary lives interrupted, about sons, brothers, and friends who were expected home, about the pain of realizing that what looked like tragedy was something far more deliberate. Their statements were measured, but powerful. There were no theatrics, just grief and the search for meaning. Prosecutors emphasized that the guilty plea spared families a prolonged trial, but it did not lessen the severity of the crimes. The judge accepted the plea. With that decision, one of Ohio's most disturbing recent criminal cases reached its legal conclusion. The court's role now was sentencing, ensuring accountability for crimes that unfolded quietly, but with devastating consequences. While exact terms would be finalized during sentencing, prosecutors made clear that Auburn would face decades in prison, with the possibility that she would never be released. Not as punishment alone, but as protection. For law enforcement, the outcome marked the end of an unusually complex case, one that required patience, restraint, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. For the families, it was something else entirely. Justice, yes, but not closure in the way people imagine, because closure does not restore what was lost. The courtroom can deliver accountability, but it cannot return time. It cannot undo trust misplaced. As Rebecca Auburn was led away, the case shifted from investigation to history, a record of what happens when patterns hide in plain sight. But the story does not end at sentencing, because long after the verdict, questions remain about prevention, awareness, and the thin line between accident and crime. Those questions will shape the final chapter of this story.
What happens after the courtroom empties? After the headlines fade? After the name at the center of the case is no longer spoken aloud? For the city of Columbus, the end of the trial was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning.
In the aftermath of the case, officials and residents alike were left with questions that had no easy answers. How many overdose deaths are accepted without scrutiny? How many patterns are missed because they resemble something familiar? And how many lives are lost before coincidence is questioned?
This case forced law enforcement to look closely at how overdose investigations are conducted, not just in Ohio, but across the country. When death looks accidental, it rarely invites doubt. And when doubt is absent, predators can operate unseen. Authorities acknowledge that the broader opioid crisis created an environment where lethal acts could hide in plain sight. Overwhelmed systems, limited resources, and a tragic expectation that overdose deaths are inevitable. The Rebecca Auburn case challenged that assumption. It demonstrated how exploitation can exist within public health crises, and how those crises can unintentionally shield criminal behavior. Law enforcement agencies began reevaluating internal protocols. Investigators discussed the importance of cross-referencing cases, recognizing patterns, and treating repeated circumstances with greater scrutiny. Not every overdose is a crime, but some are, and the difference matters. This case was not just about what happened. It was about what nearly went unnoticed. For the families of the victims, the aftermath has been deeply personal. Justice came in the form of accountability, but justice does not erase grief. Their loved ones were not case numbers. They were people with routines, relationships, and futures. Fathers, sons, friends. In victim impact statements and interviews, families spoke about the difficulty of reconciling how quietly the crimes unfolded, about the pain of knowing that trust, something so human, was used as a weapon. Closure, they said, is not a moment. It is a process. There are also unanswered questions that may never be fully resolved. Were there warning signs that went unseen? Could earlier intervention have saved lives? And how many similar cases remain buried in statistics, waiting to be re-examined? Authorities have stated that no additional victims are officially linked to the case, but the questions linger. Because patterns like this do not announce themselves, they rely on silence. The most unsettling truth may be this: some of the most dangerous crimes don't involve force. They involve familiarity. They happen in places we consider ordinary, between people who appear unremarkable, and they leave behind scenes that look like tragedy, not crime. The legacy of this case is not just a conviction, it is a warning, a reminder that vigilance matters, that assumptions can be deadly, and that justice sometimes arrives only after harm is done. As the city of Columbus continues forward, the story of these victims remains a sobering chapter, one that reshaped how investigators, prosecutors, and the public understand hidden violence. And it leaves us with a final, uncomfortable question. How many stories like this are still waiting to be seen? If you found this case compelling and want to follow more real investigations, courtroom moments, and true crime breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your likes, comments, and turning on the notification bell help you stay updated whenever we release a new story. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective.